Hello and welcome to Pushing Cardboard episode 32. This is a bit of a special episode in that all I'm putting out here is the audio version of a interview I recently did with Volko Ruhnke as part of the San Diego HistCon's online convention. I interviewed Volko to talk about designing series games. He's designed quite a few series himself, and so we talked about the history of series games, his thoughts about series games, and a couple of his new games that make up a new series. Anyway, some of you may have heard this already or seen it on YouTube, but for those who don't go on YouTube and haven't seen it yet, I'm presenting this just as a audio version of it. It was just two talking heads. There was there's nothing really to look at. So the audio version, you're getting everything that you would have got in the video version. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. This is me and Volko Ruhnke talking about series games. Hello, folks. Welcome to SD Hist Second Front. I guess I'm saying welcome, but I'm sure we're fairly late in the program here, so I imagine everybody's seen quite a few things, and including you. I'm here with Volko Ruhnke, and today we're going to be talking about designing series games and what's the main differences between series war games and one-off war games. Volko, you've had a pretty busy convention already so far, I understand.
Yeah, I sure have, and great stuff. So we did some Coast Watchers, we did some Levian campaign, we talked GMT, and I'm still looking forward actually to listening into speaking of series, a Combat Commander discussion later this evening. So here we go.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to go over any of the ground you've already gone over, but I think you've got some well-known series to your name, so I think this is an interesting topic to talk about with you. When I was starting to think about series war games, I immediately went, well, they've kind of been around since the beginning. If you think of those early Avalon Hill games, they all used the same CRT, the same movement. Basically those first golden age games like Africa Corps and D-Day and whatnot, they were actually really a series when you think about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was actually thinking similar, even though you wouldn't call it that. And I was actually, it occurred to me very vividly with regard to FPI also. I had the opportunity the other day with some friends. We went to Antietam Battlefield and we played blue and gray quad Antietam on Antietam Field, which was really cool. And I have to say the art of that 1975 product stood up very well. It's really quite a beautiful game. The game system and the rules were really quaint after 50 years. And one aspect of it is they talked in the designer's notes for Blue and Gray, which is a Civil War series, and how it basically changed very little, but a few things from their Napoleon at War series. Again, they didn't call it series, they called it quads, because you'd get four of these little folio games, right, in a pack. And so it was two different quad series, if you will. And there was Blue and Gray 1 and Blue and Gray 2. It was absolutely a series. And it was a series with Napoleon at War because the rules were so similar down to the combat results table. And I was just thinking, is that really right? Was there really so little change with the introduction of the mini ball and widespread use of rifled muskets and rifled artillery and parrot guns, between Napoleon and several generations later, the American Civil War, that you could use the same combat results table, and the same zone of control rules and so on. There again, it wasn't exactly the same, but it was so close that you were like, okay, this is a series, but this was in the day when, and as well, it wasn't just the day, it was expressly intended. We're going to make this as playable as possible. And then number two, they tell you this in the design notes. It's quite open. Number two, we will try to make it as realistic as possible. But that's number two.
Right.
And for them, I mean, it's easier from design and development perspective, but it's also easier for us players, because if we've played Napoleon at War or Napoleon's Last Battles, and now we pick up Blue and Gray 1 or Blue and Gray 2, we're going to learn it in a snap, right? Because it's the same thing almost.
Right. Yeah, and it was probably the same thing with those. I mean, the quads were definitely a series in a box, right? Each one of them. But those Avalon Hill ones, they had the same thing, because I think it was probably the same CRT with Waterloo that they used for Africa Corps, right?
For Africa Corps. And so you think, like, really? Is that, why? And so that does raise the question, why do that, right? Because you're consciously saying we had, a way that we saw combat and how odds related to outcomes in combat in Napoleonic warfare that we think was the same in World War II. Okay.
Yeah.
That's quite an assertion.
Yeah, absolutely. But it must have been quite a real discovery when they came up with their second CRT, when they went, oh, hey, we could change this and make it actually suit, fine tune the model.
Yeah. I mean, it raises a little suspicion, doesn't it? In terms of, is it just because you really believe that it fits well enough? Or is it just, well, we've come up with CRT, that was a lot of work, so let's use it some more? I mean, I don't know. It's terrible to look back 50, 60 years and second guess like that. And that's probably not fair, but it's interesting.
Well, it's totally interesting. And I think about, at that point, they were, Charles Roberts had come up with this kind of model, and it must have taken a leap of thought to then go to the next stage and go, right, oh, what parts of this can we actually change and still have a good game?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like now with the retrospect of knowing all of the different models that are out there, you're absolutely right. If you think about it, it's obvious to us that you're not, that's not it. That's not the only answer. But at that time, you're right. It would have been a leap. And, if it's, this thing is working, why it's not broken? Why fix it?
And they're starting to sell some games. But to bring it up to the current time, I think of modern series games sort of being in kind of two broad groups. There's your coin series or your Levy and Campaign series, where each game it has its own rule book, but it's based on a central sort of mechanism or something about the original game that goes through the series. And then there's other series where they actually have like the Gamers or the Blind Sword series, where they have series rules, and then each game has its own exclusive rules. And
Blue and Gray.
Like Blue and Gray, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The one seems a bit tighter, like if you think of OCS or BCS, the rules don't change too much. Whereas if we look, Coin's been around for quite a while now, and every new volume, it seems like part of the deal is to make it not the same as the last one, and to try and find specifically works. What's gonna make this new game different and unique, right?
That's right. So, and you touch on a key trade-off there, and that is, how much do we make it easier on players, on fans of the series, to keep things the same? And how much do we take advantage of whatever is to be gained from changing something, right? When you're talking about series games, that is a core trade-off in how you do things. And if we say we have series rules and we have specific volume rules or battle rules or setting rules, whatever, that absolutely makes it easier, I think, right? Because I don't have to reread the series rules. only, when I get volume 2, I only have to read the volume 2 unique rules. Okay, that's great. What's the cost of that? The cost of that is the designers are locked into the series rules. And without, second editions and errata and whatever, update kits and all the rest, if we discover by the time we get to volume 2 that there was something we could do better in the series rules, too bad, right? You're stuck with them. You're
Right.
stuck. And, when I play a game like I did the other day from 1975, boy, I feel that this is a 1975 design. The state of the art advances, and we try to learn within the series that I do. We try to learn, and we try to harness the creativity of different designers coming in and doing new things that I couldn't have conceived of, much less executed. And I tend to go for that second value that says, I don't want to be stuck with that. I absolutely stand by volume 1. It works. Rules is written, play it, and it will work. But I do want to make it better.
Right.
And if with volume 2, I can take the same core ideas, the same engine, and keep it familiar enough to call it a series, but also make it better, I want to be free to do that. And I don't know when I'm doing volume 1 where I'm going to need to do that, obviously. Otherwise, I do it in volume 1, right? I find out later because we get so many more experiments and we get so much more talent coming in with volume 2 than we had alone at volume 1 when no one was interested, right? And so that's why I've tended to go in that second vein where there isn't really a series rule book. We might even change some things that seem pretty fundamental because we found out we could do it better for you.
Right. And sometimes just changing one of you're playing the same game, but you're changing one key thing because it fits in this new setting better. Like something has to give to make it actually work in the new.
Absolutely. Now that's for sure. I mean, that's part of the contract, isn't it? That if I'm saying, here's, Nevsky, it's set on the Baltic frontier in the 13th century, and you've bought that and you've enjoyed it, and now I want to sell you volume 2, Almoravid, and it's, Muslim and Christian Spain in the 11th century. I'm not going to just take you to Russia reshaped like Spain, right? I mean, that would be very disappointing, right? That would be a violation of our contract.
All those sleds are going to not.
Right. I'm not just going to give you sleds in Spain, right? Of course not, right? Absolutely. But there, you see, there I've got license. If I need to change something because Spain in the 11th century is different than Russia in the 13th century, okay, you're going to understand. I'm going to impose this burden on you, player, that you're going to have to remember when you go from volume 1 to volume 2, that this fundamental thing, like the nature of what transport you have to choose from, or whatever it is, works differently because it's a different setting. That's the reason you get volume 2, even though you already have volume 1. That's not a problem. The problem comes in, possibly, I mean, the arguable trade-off, I would say, comes in when I say, how we did supply in Nevsky? Well, it turns out there's a better way to do it. It would have been better in Nevsky, but we didn't know it back then. But we've learned. So why repeat the mistake? Why carry forward a mistake, something that isn't as good as it could be from volume 1 to volume 2? It's not really about the setting. I mean, inherent in that is the idea that I'm confessing, yes, we could have done volume 1 better. We're learning.
Right.
And therein comes, then now it's like, okay, well, what do we do when we go back and play Nevsky? Do we play it the bad old way or do we change, and everything's interrelated in this system. So it's hard to just change one thing and not have ripple effects that are unanticipated, unintended. So it gets very tricky. That's the real, push and pull in a series is how much do we allow? Yes, one setting to another better adjust for the fact that you've changed from one setting to another, of course, because we're trying to transport ourselves to some particular place in time and in geography, right? I think should be accepted. You don't want. Okay, anyways, the question that's tougher is how much more difficulty do I give you moving through the series because we're learning as we go. That's really what's happening.
Well, I think they butted their heads up against that. The Grand Tactical System at MMP, I think they revised the series rules as they went along, but left one of the early volumes still using like the original series. So they've got two sets of like it's.
Well, but this is the thing, and that sounds like, why would you do that? But in practice, I have to sympathize with that because I'm there too. I'm sort of like, well, I'm evaluating that almost case by case. Every change you make, some changes have small cost and big payoff. Some changes have big cost in terms of the amount of change and smaller payoff. So should I just say I'm going to make every change I can every time I can? Or should I weigh and say, what is worth the pain for the payoff, the burden for the better play experience? And it may be when we look specifically at this volume or whatever, we can say, well, in this case, this isn't quite as good as it could be now with more experience and thousands of plays out there once the thing is published. But in this particular setting, it doesn't make that much difference. Let's just keep it the same. Because ultimately, I would prefer that a second edition or that errata or whatever be as small a change as possible, because I want the people with volume 1 to feel like they have as close as possible to the best thing they could have, right? And there's just friction in the system. If there's two different editions out there and we get together and we play, well, I have the first edition, well, I have the second edition. Now we got to resolve all that. Oh gosh, right? So you want to keep that daylight as small as you can, but not zero, because at zero, you give away all of the possible improvements from the experience you've earned. So you see what I'm saying? It's a trade-off, it's a dilemma, and it might resolve differently for this particular this particular MMP game in the Grand Tactical series or whatever than it does for that game. And hopefully they're making that decision to give you the best balance of improvement that they can.
I think in that case, they did retrofit those rules to some of the games, but they couldn't take it all the way back to the beginning. I think it was like they had to find how far back they could go, right, and it would work, right? It seems to me, though, with the way you do it with a dedicated rule book for every game, you kind of give yourself a little more wiggle room than games where they have a series rules, a series rules and exclusive rules for the games. Because in those ones, if they start to mess with the exclusive rules too much, you end up with an exclusive rule book that's thicker than the series rule book, and that drives players a bit crazy too, because it feels like
like the series rule book is really kind of a fib in that case. Yeah,
right. Yeah,
and so with Levy and Campaign series, the way we tried to square that circle is to give you a here's what's changed page. So in volume 2 Almoravid, it's like, here's what's different from Nevsky. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if it's because of the setting or because we learned, but here's what's different. So if you already know Nevsky and you're trying to get into Almoravid, you don't have to like hunt through like, what is different? What do I need, right? You can read on a page or so. These are the things I got to pay attention to. I better go read these rules. In fact, in Almoravid, I think I even put in like little triangle symbols at those rules to show. I think I got that idea from Richard Borg in Commands and Colors. Go read those rules because they're a bit different or very different, whatever the case may be, from Nevsky.
How does that play out though when you get to, say, volume 6?
Right, exactly. It's a great question, and we're working on getting ready for print volume 5. So I don't know yet with volume 6. That's a great question. So with volume 3, we gave you a here's what's different from, I think we get with Inferno. I think we gave you a here's what's different from Nevsky and here's what's different from Almoravid. Or maybe we just did here's what's different from earlier volumes. But eventually, if there's 4 earlier volumes or 5 earlier volumes, and by the way, volume 4 in Levy and Campaign, Plantagenet, which is the first volume that I'm not a designer. I'm involved, but I'm not even a co-designer of Plantagenet. It's quite different. It's also a very different late, high Middle Ages, very end of the Middle Ages, Civil War. It's a very different conflict than the early ones. So it's very different. Now we're like, okay, well, we just kind of got to identify a earlier volumes core and what's different from that, but which is a lot. So you're right. It's not. This is the thing. It's complexity, right? It's not. There's not sort of a clean, obvious answer that just print a series rule book and then print series rules and it'll be fine. There's always a gain and a loss from each way you choose to do it.
Right. I'm looking at Kevin's question here about GMT providing counters to make earlier games work, and if it's unusual, I think it's totally unusual, totally welcome, but I can't think of a lot of times where companies have gone out of their way to retrofit rules and then provided counters for them like that.
I think that, speaking of GMT, I don't know other companies as well, but GMT and its relationship with C3I magazine from Roger McGowan has done a lot of this sort of thing where there are update kits. Sometimes they're extreme enough, there are enough in them that you have to buy them. There are ones they may just mail you. I get them. I didn't know it was even coming. Here it is. It's a, corrective kit that has redone cards or counters or whatever, or charts or player aids. And then with C3I magazine, Roger always tries to put in it's like update counters. It's like individual counters, and there might be 20 different games or whatever. And if you happen to have this game, because I know this as a designer, Roger reaches out to designers and says, would you like to have any counter updates in the next issue of C3I? And that gives you the opportunity to enhance something, to refine something, to fix something, right? And it wouldn't just be a thing like, well, this number 4 on the counter should be a number 5. It might be, we came up with this new rules variant, which we can transmit the rules variant on Board Game Geek and on the game page from the publisher and so forth. But here in C3I, we can actually give you the counters to implement it fully, right? So I think that what is described, what Kevin describes for Glory is in a similar vein, where there is the ability. It's not as common and easy as downloadable content for a computer game, but there are opportunities for patches of physical games that GMT tries to take advantage of.
This question is great. It makes me think of Coin, because Coin has gone so much farther now. It seems to me that people like you and John Butterfield, who have got a few different series under your belts, you design the first 2, maybe 3, and then sort of put it out there, and other designers take over.
Yeah.
Do you ever worry that the new designers will take it in a direction you didn't want it to go?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. No, I don't. I don't worry about that. So I used to work in intelligence analysis, and you had like a domain, an account, we called it, an issue that you worked, whatever, and you got expert in that, and you were responsible for what the community had to say in that area and so forth, and you kind of felt ownership, and that feeling of ownership could get in the way of a better joint or corporate product on behalf of the constituents. And so one phrase was, don't think of it as ownership, but rather as stewardship, right? It isn't exactly my baby. I have my children that are my designs that I've done, or co-designs maybe. And then there are designs based on my designs that are like my grandchildren. I care about them and I love them all, but they're out doing their thing. And an absolute joy for me is that other designers come in, they're interested enough in this material, whatever I've kind of wrought at the beginning of a series, to take it in a direction. It's not that I don't want it to go. I just never could have thought of that. I just never would have thought it would work or be worthwhile until somebody else takes it and makes it into something great, right? So I'm seeing right now I mentioned Plantagenet in Loving Campaign, Francisco Gradija goes by Paco, and it's so different from Volume 4 of Loving Campaign is so different from Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And it seems to be really grabbing folks. It's gonna sell out before the previous 2 volumes sell out, I suspect, Well, and if that's a measure, it's better than anything I did or could have done. Well, why would I not want that? Because,
of course.
Yeah, because let a thousand flowers bloom. And for me, if it's a matter of personal pride, hey, look, there wouldn't be Plantagenet if it wasn't for Nevsky. Okay, as a designer, what do we want to do? We want people playing our games. Yes, we also want to influence the state of the art. The state of the art is advancing, and if there's some of me in Plantagenet, that's just I'm very proud of that.
You must have had, in the way that Plantagenet changed things like, no sieges, for example, that you hadn't thought of. You must have felt the same way in Coin when, like, Brian did the first 2-player Coin game. You must have went
100%. 100%. I would have said, Brian, you don't get it. You don't understand what the Coin series is about. It's multifactional. All insurgencies are multifactional. Kilcullen wrote it. Colonial Twilight's awesome.
Yeah, totally.
And now we have, the Irregular Conflict series, which is like, this is like my grandnephew or something now,
Yes, right.
A coin adjacent, as Jason Carr puts it. And they're focusing on, fewer than the original 4 players. I wouldn't have ever imagined it.
Yeah, right. So, or same with the, maybe it's the British Way box with the 4 games that are all just 2-player each, and they work like a dream. I had my doubts about that series, or about that box, just thinking, oh, they're going to be too short. There's not going to be enough to do. But I've played all 4 of them now, and all of them were like, we were on the edge of our seats the whole time.
Yeah, and I mean, and how sad and tragic and pitiful if I were like, no, this is my little thing over here. Don't mess with it. Come on.
Right. Yeah. Well, like you said, you always get to be the granddaddy of all of it in a way. I wondered another thing, though. I was trying to think about, is there, what are the possible disadvantages of series games? Do you think there's any chance that it somehow dulls creativity in designers if they're trying to fit it into a system?
That's a really interesting question.
I mean, some designers talk about how they really love constraints. It gives them somewhere to go. So I could see some working well for that.
I suppose my first question would be, well, why do you have to do it within the series then? Do what you want. Nothing's patented here. You could take what you like and leave the rest by the roadside if you don't.
Right.
But I suppose it might be, well, if I can call it the name of a popular series and have that imprimatur, then it will go forward faster and reach more people. And does that, bind? And it might, I suppose. So I think the likelihood is that the less experienced you are at design, the more you are likely to mirror existing forms. So I'll use myself as an example. That might not be a good thing. It might or might not be a good thing. So this is kind of trying to get to how it might be disadvantageous to have design in a series. So for myself, my first whole published design was Wilderness War, a quarter century ago. And the concept of Wilderness War was, I take Mark Simonich's Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage, plus a few lessons learned from a few other games here and there. And I use that to recreate the French and Indian War. Okay. So there are some things there that are very, format loyal. Like, for example, in Wilderness War, if you have a 3 card, that's the card that allows you to do a naval move. Because I saw that in Hannibal Rome versus Carthage. That seemed to work. Why change it? What do I know? I'm a first-time designer, right? The further I went, if you look at my whatever product, my works, I think you'll see the further I went, the less I was tied to old forms, and the more I was trying to experiment and do, things that hadn't been done before, instead of mimicking, I guess. I think that's natural. And so it could be that you're mimicking something when you're in a series. You're mimicking something that isn't worth mimicking in your particular project, in your particular setting. I think that can happen. I also think in terms of perception, you can get to the idea that the reason this game is done the way it is because it's trying to shoehorn a situation into a series. And therefore, I, the player, do not buy the model as much as I otherwise would if it were not in the series. And I mean, I guess that may be true, but you may also be exaggerating that feeling, because in fact, what happened is the designer said, oh, I have my own model of this conflict in history. And I think actually it would fit in the Series X coin series or whatever very well, and which would give it a different perspective and a different focus than other games done on that or whatever. And they've made that choice. So yes, designers can make that choice badly. You can always model things more, worse than you otherwise might have done. It doesn't happen automatically, but yes, I suppose it can happen.
Well, Arthur's got an interesting question, and I was talking to John Butterfield for my podcast recently, and he's designed some great series as well. Just like you, he's got different series that are all quite different from each other.
Yes.
I asked him, if he started each one thinking it would be a series, and he said, "Oh no, each time it was a total surprise to me. I didn't really know I had a series until I started working on the second game and realized that I could actually use the main mechanisms from a previous game. So it was always a surprise to him. But I remember talking to you about a year ago, and I was sure that you had designed Nevsky just as a game, and the idea of a series came later. But you said you kind of had the idea for the series, and then you had the idea for the game. So I don't know. My feeling is that you're maybe more uncommon in that you get the idea for the whole series first rather than the idea for a standalone game first.
Yeah, yes, it does. I don't know how common or uncommon it is necessarily. And it's not that I have the idea for the whole series. That has never succeeded. I have an idea for a whole series. It just has never turned out to be what I wanted. However, certainly with the coin series and with the Levian campaign series, this is going to be a series. I have some volumes in mind, and this is volume 1. And that is true. And so, and why is that? And to address Arthur's question, I do think I enjoy the design of series games. And I think at the heart of it is this, that I am trying to see systems in history, in human interaction, and then trying to see game systems, tabletop models that will reflect key dynamics in those historical systems that I'm interested in. And those historical systems in humanity tend to travel, they're syndromatic. There's certain ways that European medieval armies fought. there's certain things that happen in modern insurgency and counterinsurgency. And I see some gap between what I think is happening in this human endeavor, this type of warfare or whatever, and the way that we've modeled it on the tabletop in war games, in board games. And I'm trying to, fill that. I'm trying to say, let me see if there's a way that our board games can handle modeling this kind of human system differently. And then if I come up with some answers to that, then I'm like, okay, but medieval Europe is centuries of time, and there are many different cultures in it that affect the particulars. And so now I think I have a game system that will handle medieval operational warfare at least differently and hopefully better than has been done. And where do I apply it? Because I'm not going to apply it to all of Europe. It's an operational game, right? Well, there's a lot to choose from. There are all kinds of wars, and there are many centuries, and there are many cultures, right? And so then I think about, well, I'm interested in the Baltic frontier, and I'm interested in the Teutonic Knights and Rus, Novgorod and Rus, and all that. Okay, well, that's like one volume, but I also want to do the Reconquista, and I want to do this and I want to do that. And so right away I'm like, okay, I think I have a game system that is new and fresh and informative. And I have many settings one could apply that to, and I'm going to apply it to whatever. 4 of them was what I thought with Coin Series. 4 of them is what I thought geographically distributed for Levian Campaign Series. In both cases, it was going to be 4 volumes in 4 different parts of that world.
The quad
didn't turn out that way. Didn't turn out that way, but that's why so that's interesting to me, right? A system that tries to distill dynamics of a particular flavor of endeavor of warfare, but apply it specifically to cases, right? Like case study, right? Like think about legal case study. We did the same thing in intelligence. We had intelligence analytic cases where there are principles we can distill. We're looking for key internal dynamics, but we want to talk about something concrete that really happened, because details matter and individuals matter and cultures matter, right? And so that just recommends a series, doesn't it? A system that tries to take on these key dynamics, but gives it expression, not generically, right? Not plain, bland, vanilla, but in a specific setting so that you can experience these dynamic principles that I am espousing with this system, like my theory of how whatever medieval operations worked. But you travel to a specific place and a specific time with specific individuals who really lived.
Right. So in a way, your system is a hypothesis, and you run it through 3 or 4 settings as tests of the experiment, in a way, to see if the hypothesis holds up.
Right. Does the system work? If it works, if I'm asserting that these are fundamental dynamics of medieval warfare that translate across a few centuries and across a continent, right? And I apply that to model Novgorod and Rus, and I then apply that to model Andalus 2 centuries earlier. Does it work? Absolutely. Yeah. And guess what? Sometimes it doesn't work perfectly. And that's when we get back to your earlier point. So what should I do? I should sit on my hands and say, well, I did it that way in volume 1, so you're just stuck with it. No. Yeah. Okay. You're right. We could model that better. We changed the core system a little bit. Hopefully not so much that we can't call it a series. You're still going to get a benefit from having learned volume 1 when you play volume 2. But yes, our model improved between volume 1 and volume 2. Why shouldn't I be proud of that?
Right. Yeah. And when we look at Coin, it's up to, I don't know, volume 9 or 11 or something. It's, that's like this giant layer upon layer upon layer, or you can think of it as branch upon branch upon branch.
Yeah. And I think of learning, of more people contributing ideas and making it better. And so the question from Bible Lord, do I overthink a series, trying to plan too far out and not getting the first game done? I don't. I mean, first of all, it's not really overthinking for me, because I'm not earning my living this way. I'm doing this for fun and as a joy, as love and all that. So I love thinking forward and here's what it could be and dreaming my dreamy dreams. I mean, I'm doing that in my spare times too. So there's no way to go wrong with that. But I do set on that first game to get it done because that's how it will become something. I learn by doing. So the game gets done. It's not overthought, but it's, I guess, fanciful to plan the series. And I can say that from experience because, as I said, it's never gone the way I thought. It's never been here are the it's going to be like, here are the 4 volumes and I'm done. No, it's not like that. I do volume 1 and then volume 2 is something else that somebody else suggested and we're doing together. And we're off to the races, joyously doing things I never planned in the beginning, right? But there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's nothing sacred about a plan.
Bringing it forward to the stuff you're working on right now with Coast Watchers and Blackbeard, they're not exact, like Coast Watchers is the first game of a new series, but it's somewhat influenced by Blackbeard.
Yeah.
Like these were your first 2 block games, I think.
That's right. Yes. And block games, and I think a different way than your standard, Columbia style block war games, which I love. And I mean, Blackbeard and Coast Watchers, I think, is a good example of something we talked about in SD HistCon elsewhere, by the way, and that is the fact that, games have genealogy. My friend Artur gave a great talk about his design process and kind of thinking about what do you expose yourself to in other designs? Does it contaminate your design or does it enhance it? And you're actually in the end synthesizing, right? To come up with something better that does combine other people's ideas with your own ideas and your own application to your particular project. So that gives all of technology, all of art, music, and so forth, genealogy, right? And that's true for individual designers too. So in a very small example, in Blackbeard, I was trying to solve certain problems with regard to an intelligence game, a manhunting game, certain problems in hidden information that I didn't think any of the systems going back the last 70 years could fully handle what I needed. So I came up, by the way, not by myself, but with my friends and play testers, and came up with a way to do that for Hunt for Blackbeard's purpose that was new in some small ways. Used blocks in some old ways, but also in some new ways. It was a synthesis. And then that was so interesting, I thought, as a system in Hunt for Blackbeard, that some years later, I thought about what else could I apply that mechanical solution to that has to do with intelligence and reconnaissance and hidden information and denial and deception and the like. And that led to my interest in the Coast Watchers. And this happened, by the way, in the Coin series. This happened in Labyrinth. This happened in Levy and Campaign, where I have a certain game mechanical design toolbox that I'm interested in doing more with this or that tool, typically that I've seen somewhere else. But I think I can apply in new ways to new situations. And then I start, well, what are the new situations? So, it's not so clean in practice, at least not for me, as the distinction you hear sometimes between Euro games and war games, where the Euro game is its mechanics and it's all about the mechanics. And then maybe we dress it up with a theme to make it a little more interesting or evocative, versus war games where it's history. It's a real life human dynamic that we're then looking for mechanics to model. There's truth in that. There's truth in that distinction. However, it's not absolute. It's not that the war game designer, in my view, just says, well, mechanics be damned. I'm just interested in the Battle of the Bulge. No, of course that designer is reaching into a toolbox of pre-existing ideas about mechanics and using them to new purposes. And that means the designer of war games also probably is enticed and excited by the potential for certain mechanics to simulate history, right? And so it's kind of some of this and some of that as you go forward into a series.
Right, of course. You're interested in the series, but you're also a game designer. They are still games. They're not 100% simulations or I don't know, recreations. You've got to be, if you're going to be interested in designing games, you've got to be interested in the mechanics as well as the history.
100% you do. And it's not, and in fact, I don't even see a games versus simulations dichotomy at all. I think it's more of a Venn diagram, that there are games that are simulations and games that are not simulations. And there's a mix of two. There are simulations that are games and there are simulations that are not games. And what you and I and this community happens to be into is games that simulate history, okay? And you need some elements of both, and you are absolutely making compromises. But by the way, all simulations make compromises in how they model reality, because that's the nature of a model. It's always a simplification of reality to some purpose. And part of our purpose is a fun game to play, absolutely. And so, yes, we make concessions to that purpose.
And in our community, there's some people who want like the game part is more important, and some people want some fidelity to recreation is more important, and they're like it's just a giant scale. Everybody fits somewhere on that scale, whichever end. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, and there's games out there for people interested either way.
Yeah, I absolutely. And what I think you have put your finger on is the nature of fun, which, if you ask what is give me a full description of the nature of fun, you're going to have as many answers as you have players in the room.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And no answer is more right than the others. Before we keep talking about the new series, but this is an interesting question from Molotov Cockatiel.
Yeah. I don't think that there is a hard line, because if there were, I don't think we would have any 2-player coin games, for example, in terms of how we wouldn't have had any coin games that weren't modern counterinsurgencies, probably, if I had said, I'm going to fight for this certain aspect. I have found it has not been a problem, because the designs that succeed, and so the designers that succeed, keep in mind the trade-off that we started to talk about, that every series faces of familiarity versus a good thing, familiarity versus sameness, a bad thing, right? So there's a contract with the buyer, with the player, that if it's a certain series, it's a coin series game, that when you purchase that game or you sit down to play that game or sit down to learn that game, that you're going to recognize earlier volumes in it. You're going to recognize that genealogy, you're going to recognize that DNA, and that's going to be in a helpful way. It's going to help you. It's going to lower the burden of learning that game and getting up and running. So I don't have like an acid test of that says, oh, it has to be 4-player, or it has to be modern insurgency, or it has to even have cards, I suppose. But then we have to envision how could we have something that you, new designer doing this or whatever, you want to call this the coin series and it doesn't have cards in it? How are you going to pull that off with enough familiarity that the people who, buy your game and play your game will say, yeah, this is a coin series game. I wasn't misled. This was not a bait and switch. This is a coin series game, right? I mean, there's no hard lines, but that is a judgment call. And my experience has been all the designers I've worked with get that. On the other side of that, though, and this is the reason I wouldn't want to fight exactly or resist as the person who happened to design volume 1, is the sameness. Because if we have a volume 10 of the coin series or a volume 7 of the Levian campaign series, as we do, an implicit part of that contract is even if you own all the previous volumes, it's worth it to get this additional one, right? It's, we don't want to hear the word reskin. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't, again, if I were saying, buy a volume 2 Almoravid because you like Nevsky, you'll be playing Nevsky. It just happens to be shaped like the Iberian Peninsula. That would be a fail, right? Every volume has to offer something new and different to not be too samey, right? At the same time that it maintains some familiar core to reward you for the investment you've made in learning the earlier volumes. And because truth in advertising, if we call it coin series, it's got to resemble something. Okay, there is a lot of room there for individuality and creativity and that. But I've not yet run into a case where a designer proposed something for a series that I had started that was so different that I'm like, no, it's not recognizable. Plantagenet's very different than Nevsky, but I think you're going to absolutely recognize Levian campaign and Plantagenet.
Yeah, I totally agree. To come back to your current series, what are you calling the new series, by the way?
Okay, so if Coast Watchers turns out to be volume 1, it will be the Recon series.
Right.
Recon as in reconnaissance.
And the next game, we'll talk about that later as well. But it uses the same key mechanic of having the blocks and having one player look away while the other player can see something, and then when you look back, you don't know what he's looked or he or she has looked at. You don't know the nature of that. But
and a little bit more. So Coast Watchers does not use dice. It uses 2 draw cups, one that each player runs for resolution of some of essentially when there's contact between adversaries. And the next game in the series will do the same. We'll have the for slightly different purposes, but mechanically very similar, so that it'll feel, you've mastered how this kind of mechanic works. Well, this has the same kind of mechanic, just applied to in a different way.
Well, it seems that this new series, which you're calling Recon, is a lot about then intelligence, and it feels like you're getting closer to your work history. You worked for a lot of years in intelligence. Does that make these, I don't know, somehow more personal? Like, do you understand what I'm saying? That
it's a good.
There's a bit of an overlap between your work life and where you come to.
It requires some introspection. Yes and no. So let's go back. History is a lot of interpretation. When a historian writes, there's a lot of that historian in there, right? It's not just facts and dates and documents, right? There's a lot of interpretation that contains the experience, the personality, the bias of the historian. Okay, I think it's very similar with historical simulation games. So all of these things are personal to me in some way. And actually, if you think about the topic of Labyrinth or the setting of some of the coin series games, they have a lot to do with what I was doing in my day job.
Right.
That in a way, I'm happy to kind of leave behind. I'm retired now. I kind of did my time, and I'm a time tourist. I'd rather be back in the 18th century or, in World War I or whatever. Anyway, it's almost a form of escape. So thematically, you're absolutely right. There are principles that I was involved in using, developing, and teaching in my professional life back then that are very much a part of and show up in the Recon series. Yes. But they're principles applied to settings, like in Hunt for Blackbeard, that are rather removed, much more removed than Labyrinth or A Distant Plane, for example, that from the environments that I was dealing with in those days. So in a way, it's a little bit more like retirement projects where I'm taking something away from that time, conceptually, theoretically, but I'm applying it to, things that are long past enough that I don't have to
I have
be
to
too
think though
personal
that
about it.
The depth of like the deception and counter deception and that cat and mouse game that goes on in Coast Watcher, for example, that your background has made that. I don't. You've thought about that kind of intelligence and counterintelligence,
Yeah.
maybe a little more deeply than a designer who doesn't have the same background as you and has been only thinking about kinetic warfare, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it may be. I mean, I used to make my living that way. So hopefully I was, thinking about it productively and applying it productively. And of course, I made a lot of mistakes,
I just think about when we were talking in a previous discussion, and we were talking about Coast Watchers, and you were explaining the game, and there was a lot of, I could do this, but then would he think I was doing this, or would he think, or maybe he I think he's thinking I'm thinking, like
exactly. Yeah. So yes, and if you're interested in my kind of theoretical and game historical breakdown on all of that, I have an article in the current issue of C3I Magazine 37. The article is called "Denial and Deception in War Games," and it's taking some of that theory from intelligence work and applying it to how have designers tried to use mechanics that enhance the opportunities for players to engage in that with each other, right? We can always do that in a game with each other because I've got secrets, which is what I'm thinking of doing next. You don't know, right? And I have channels to influence you, to deceive you by what I do and what I don't do, and other things like that. But to what degree do mechanics actually open up those possibilities between us of denial and deception? And so I've got a sort of a review of the history of war games that, like blocks, what do blocks do for you and so forth. And Hunt for Blackbeard and Coast Watchers, and if it becomes a series, the Recon series is a kind of a newer answer from me about what else we could do better, because there were some problems about that I thought remained unsolved mechanically. For example, the issue of me finding out something about you and you don't know that I found that out about you. In fact, you don't even know that I was looking for that there, right? Tabletop games have had trouble handling that kind of thing. But in real life warfare, in real life intelligence, it's critical. It's absolutely critical that if I've discovered this secret that you have, that you don't know that I've discovered the secret that you have, right?
The whole history of Ultra was exactly that, not letting them know that we knew. And
yeah,
it was key.
Yeah, and that's very hard to do in board games, in part, in historical board games, especially in part because of retrospect, right? That and by the way, my solutions don't fully solve this either. I'm just trying to take some steps forward. But if a key aspect of a campaign is something like Ultra, and it's a historical, we know it now, but the adversary didn't know it at the time. How do we bring that into the game, right? This is just a part of a larger problem of hindsight, in historical board games. But it is particularly intense when there's a big secret like that. So here, I'm not necessarily cracking that nut, but at least I'm trying to get at, with the way that these games use blocks, Hunt for Blackbeard and Coast Watchers, I'm trying to get at, I have searched for you in this spot, and you don't know that I've searched for you there. You might know that I'm searching, but you don't know that I've found you there, right? I think Hunt for Blackbeard and Coast Watchers and the next game in line, which we are referring to, I think solve that in a new mechanical way that, that has new possibilities, let's say.
Right, because it's all about hidden information, and that's always been, that's what makes games about Bismarck tricky and things like that.
Yes,
or,
exactly.
Or carrier engagements in the South Pacific. Those,
Yes.
because the key to so many of those engagements is who finds the other fleet first.
Right. And if you're doing it realistically, I can't just look for the Bismarck anywhere, right? I can't just look for the American carriers anywhere. I have to be able to, I have to have a reconnaissance assets that can reach there. Or another example of that is the operational maneuver part of Jutland, of the old Jutland that did the World War I dreadnought battle. And so we can plot movement on a grid, we can keep pieces behind a screen or whatever. But the problem was, when you do search, if you're going to do it realistically, I just can't search the whole Pacific or the whole North Sea or whatever. I have to announce a grid square to you, let's say, might be, do you have anything in B26? And you would say, yes, I have a fleet there. No, there's nothing there. Okay, so what's just happened? First of all, if your fleet was there, you'd know for sure you just been spotted because you just told me, right? But that's not always the case. It's not always the case that the carriers saw the enemy aircraft that just spotted them, right? So that's the first part. The second part is, you also know I just searched there, whether you have something there or not. I may be way off, and I've just searched there. How was I able to search there? I've got aircraft or whatever it is I'm spotting with, ships in Jutland that are within range. I've just given away some information about my position that historically you wouldn't have. And that has huge impact. And I just found that these traditional ways of handling denial in those operational and tactical situations didn't handle that. And I had to crack that problem for Hunt for Blackbeard, because a key aspect of the Hunt for Blackbeard was that Blackbeard didn't really realize how fervently the Virginians and the Royal Navy were hunting him in the first place. And secondly, how much they knew about where he was camped out and what his movements were. And that's how he lost his life.
And in Hunt for Blackbeard, you use a similar mechanism to Coast Watchers, where the Blackbeard player looks away, and the Virginians or the Royal Navy can have a quick peek at and the Blackbeard player doesn't know where they've checked.
Exactly so. So that whole kind of mechanic that is in Coast Watchers comes from Hunt for Blackbeard, right? Comes from this idea of, I've got a mechanic here that solved some problems for me for this 1718 pirate manhunt, that I think I can do something else. And I want to do something that's about human intelligence in a military setting. And Coast Watchers just was I thought, a great story and a great topic with dynamics to explore. And so it was a marriage of a topic and a mechanic to create this new game. But Hunt for Blackbeard did that exactly, to solve that problem. And it happens particularly in Hunt for Blackbeard with intelligence, when the Virginians and the Navy, Governor Spotswood, who are trying to figure out what's going on in North Carolina, where Hunt for Blackbeard seems to have obtained some sanctuary next door. Well, they have informants. And in particular, there are people in North Carolina who don't like the fact that Blackbeard is there. Or more importantly, more fundamentally, don't like the people in North Carolina who are friendly with Blackbeard and want to harm them by informing on the pro-Blackbeard party in North Carolina, informing on them to the Virginians, to the Royal Colony, who's going to tell the Royal Navy and get rid of the problem. And in that process, politically hurt the people harboring Blackbeard, right? So there's all this political stuff. So for that to operate in the game, the hunters, the Navy, when they have an informant to look at what's going on in North Carolina, that has to be secret. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And so from that, we're like, well, how do we do that? And I'm just like, well, you've got hidden information. It might be hidden counters. It might be blocks, whatever, that show the locations of the pirates or what they're doing. And you just ask the pirate player to close their eyes for a couple seconds. You look at that information in that location. Maybe you see something, maybe you don't. And, all that, in fact, in Hunt for Blackbeard, the pirate player doesn't know that any informants have been used at all because, you have that moment. Okay, do your informants. Okay, please close your eyes. Okay, I'm done. Maybe you did nothing. Maybe you got nothing. Maybe you just spotted the pirate camp. Maybe you know where the ship is. So that mechanic worked for Hunt for Blackbeard and was very attractive to carry forward to the South Pacific in World War II.
How did you come up with? I mean, like so many great mechanics, it's simple, right? It's like there's a million games where they solve a problem in a really complex way, and you're going through 15 charts and tables and die roll modifiers, and but the really great solutions to problems are always the simple ones. Where did that come from? What was your eureka moment?
Yeah, so the games all have genealogy, and Hunt for Blackbeard actually comes from a classroom game where we're teaching intelligence analysts about what are the dynamics of hunting fugitives. Okay, now we had it in a modern setting, and I co-designed a game called Kingpin about the Mexican hunt for El Chapo as of 2014, so a modern setting. And that required solving some of these problems in simple ways, because if it's a professional training game, you have a few hours at most with the trainees, and the lessons have to be pretty quick, right? So we had to find simple solutions. And then the desire was to answer Artur's question. Then the desire on my part was, hey, we've got some lessons learned from a manhunting game for the classroom. There are lots of historical cases of manhunting. And can we take any of those mechanical lessons to bring those historical situations to life for a hobby audience, a commercial game? And that led me to the story of the Hunt for Blackbeard. It went in that order. And now the problem was, well, in a classroom, you have facilitators, and you don't have to worry about replay value. You're mainly worried about, learning objectives and things like that. This is a different purpose. So now we had to say, how can we have a two-player game that goes on without a referee? That was a problem to solve. And that would be replayable and fun every time, and actually play in even less time. So there wasn't any, all of those were different steps. A eureka moment, though, I will give you one eureka moment. And that was that now in retrospect is like, of course, right? But originally Hunt for Blackbeard, similar to the classroom game, logged what you had found out about the pirates as the hunters, logged behind a screen. You were actually keeping a duplicate map that had little markers to record not just what information you had, but how dated the information was. It was a little bit complicated and a lot of counters. And Blackbeard was logging moves behind a little map and then recreating them with face down counters on the main map. But you had to have your own version of face up counters behind the screen because it's hard to see what's going on with face down counters. And I had produced this play test set with all these counters. I just happened to have these little wooden chips, and it was just easier to sticker these little wooden chips, these square chips, rather than, make counters. So I actually had all these counters on little wooden chips. And I was playing with my friend Mike, who's now the developer for Coast Watchers. And he just took his counters and he turned them up on end, these little wooden chips. He just turned them up on end so he could see what all his counters were, even though they were face down to me. And it's like, oh yeah, blocks, Of course, we've had this technology for 50 years, of course, but that wasn't the channel that we were flowing down from the classroom game, okay? Because the classroom game used screens and facilitators and was different. And I'm like, well, of course, we'll just get rid of all those counters and use stand-up blocks, because now you don't need to replicate it. You can see them all. That's the whole point of stand-up blocks. Like, now it's using those blocks in a different way than Columbia does. These aren't units that are moving around that are hidden. Each block is a location, but it uses the fact that if you stand up a block, I can see the information on my side and all you see is the back of the block. Duh.
Yeah, it's a great repurposing of blocks.
Yeah. Which, but it comes about serendipitously. It's like, yeah. Anyways, sometimes I have to bumble into something, I guess.
Well, the other thing you touched on this earlier. The other thing that's interesting about Coast Watchers is there's no dice. It's just a couple of two different dice cups,
Right.
chit cups, where you and you vary the ratio of different answers that are in each of those cups depending on what the situation is.
Yes, I have found that that's really powerful mechanically. And one of the inspirations for that was Amabel Holland's use of chits in cups. In Agricola, Master of Britain is one example, and a smaller example is in Supply Lines, the American Revolution, Southern Strategy. And the advantage of the cups, as she demonstrated, is that you can very simply reproduce very subtle changes in probabilities. So if you want to have different probabilities for random events with dice, you either have to have a lot of modifiers and things that influence the meaning of the die roll. And I hate like long lists of die roll modifiers that I have to add up, for all these circumstances. Or you just have to have a lot of different dice, like a role-playing game, you have 4-sided dice and 12-sided dice, whatever, so that you can, and then charts, right? To use those dice to achieve the probabilistic nuances that you want for simulation. If you have a cup, and I'm using 2 cups in the game with only 2 flavors of chits in each, that's it. But now if I add a chit or I take a chit out, I'm very subtly modifying the probability that you're going to choose either the red chit or the blue chit, whatever it is, right? The good chit or the bad chit for you.
Right. It's like going to two red and 8 blue to 3 red, 8 blue. It's just a tiny
but
shift.
Very easily implemented, right? And tracked and visible. So an example of that is how in Coast Watchers, how air and sea patrol by the Japanese works. So there's one cup as a delivery cup, and the Coast Watchers, they have to move personnel and material in and out of enemy territory, and there's risk in that. So you have to do, if you want to successfully insert somebody or rescue somebody or resupply somebody or whatever, you're going to have to do a cup draw to see where you spotted. That's the question. Were you spotted? And, how severely were you spotted early enough that wrecked the whole mission? Or were you just spotted on the way out, but now they know something about the Coast Watcher that you just resupplied or whatever? So there's sighting chits and nothing sighted chits, good and bad in the cup. And now I can vary that for what type of delivery asset are you using. Is it boats? Is it a Catalina aircraft? Or is it a very stealthy submarine or something else? I can have it be different combinations by that card. It's just pictured right on the card. Put in 3 red chits and 8 green chits or whatever it is, right? And I can then further influence that by how many Japanese patrol, air and sea patrols are out there looking for you. Do you have Zeros basically looking for these aircraft? Do you have barges that are searching for these coves where these deliveries are happening, and so on? And each of those might modify the number of non-sighting chits that have to come out first before you draw. And now I have lots and lots of granularity, nuance in what the risk is of the Coast Watchers attempting another delivery mission under these circumstances with no die roll modifiers. In fact, not lots of different kinds of dice and shapes of dice, no dice at all, just two different kinds of markers, and a cup.
And no charts to look up.
No charts.
It's not even,
I mean,
it's not even like a percentile die and having to look up.
No, I mean, you do have to, there's a chart, but you're going to memorize it after the first couple times you do it. Because if you draw two chits from that kind of cup, there are only three things that can happen. Good, bad, bad. So there are really only three results there. It's a little, for the other cup, the Japanese search cup, it's a little more detailed because you might be drawing one chit, two chits, or three chits, depending on what kind of Japanese patrols are involved. And now you've got four different things that can happen. If all we count is how many bad chits, it could be 0 bad chits, 1 bad chit, 2 bad chit, 3 bad chits. That's it. And so, yes, there's a table that tells you for those four things, what does it mean? But you memorize it pretty quickly because it's not that many different things, right? That can happen.
Well, I know you've talked about Coast Watchers earlier today. I'm interested to know, I think that if Coast Watchers is successful and you move on, and in the Recon series, your next idea is a World War I game where we're talking about not so much the air war, but the air war in terms of intelligence and recon. Is that,
exactly.
Have I got that right?
You do have that exactly right, Grant. Yes. So I already have a design, and it's like mostly designed. It's complete functioning game. I haven't written all the scenarios yet. We've been playing it with some friends, and I think it works pretty well. And there's a lot of deception, denial and deception intricacy in it. It's pretty intense, actually. And the premise of the game, it's called Drachen right now, the German for kite, because of the kite balloons, the observation balloons in World War I that were so important. And it does exactly what you said. It takes on the air war, but not with the focus on aces dueling against each other and that kind of thing. But what was it all about? Why was the air war even so important with these, what we now consider primitive machines? And that is that the premise is that in trench warfare, the trenches took away the ability of cavalry to do reconnaissance, which it always had done. And something had to replace that. Without cavalry being able to get past the wire and the machine guns and the artillery and everything, all you knew of the enemy was like just what was a couple hundred yards in front of you. And you had to replace that with something. And the something that replaced that, of course, was aircraft, aeroplanes, and also balloons. And to a lesser degree, trench raids became very important as well. And that became the premise of the game is that's determinant. That if I'm the one who gets to fly over your trenches and your rear areas, take photographs, range artillery, guide artillery fire, and come back with my airplane alive. If I'm the one who can do that and you can't do that to me, I win. Because I know what to shoot. We both have a lot of firepower on the line, and I'm the one who can destroy you before you can do anything. Or I can predict where you're going to attack me with your infantry so well that I can destroy that and I can defend against you, right? And so in the game, that's what you're playing out. You're focused on the air war, including balloons and balloon busting and fighter missions and reconnaissance patrols and ranging artillery with aircraft. You are also positioning your troops, your guns and your men and your supplies as well. And we're going to resolve the combat, actually. But it's going to come down to how well you're doing in the reconnaissance game. So the cups and the chit cups and the resolution of that and a lot of the capability cards and so forth have to do with reconnaissance and resolving the reconnaissance that allows me to spot my guns on your targets and kill you, or put in the right number of men in the right places without them themselves being suppressed or destroyed by your artillery to succeed. And the resolution of that combat, the artillery fire and the infantry assault, is actually deterministic.
Right.
Because the variability is built into the reconnaissance push and pull before the big push.
In that deterministic combat that happens, is that like the end of the game in a way, similar to Coast Watchers, when the Japanese finally pull the trigger and launch their mission. And
yes and no. Yes, there's a similarity. So there's a serious familiarity there, and that is true. That they're typically will culminate on turn 3 or 4 in Drachen, an offensive, an infantry assault that goes through a couple of steps, and then we'll find out who wins, and that ends the game. And if the attacker launches that push on turn 3, that's it. If waits till turn 4, then that's it, right? However, there's a bit more intensity to the combat itself than in Coast Watchers. So you recall in Coast Watchers, the Japanese are doing their military buildup. The Coast Watchers are trying to spy and report on these military buildups. The Japanese are trying to hunt down the Coast Watchers to prevent that and take captives. And then at some point, as you said, the Japanese might or might not launch an operation or two, which is just sending out their ships and aircraft. And the question is, how well do the Coast Watchers provide tactical warning? And the game is over. You don't actually in Coast Watchers resolve, well, how well did that raid really go or whatever?
Right.
Did they bomb Henderson Field effectively or not? We're only resolving how well did the Coast Watchers inform and warn against it, right? Okay, but in Drachen, it actually does a little bit more. And that combat that we do resolve, you find out at the end, how well did the infantry assault go? Did it take any ground? Or did it just get pushed back and held? You also find out, what does the artillery suppress or kill? You actually do fire your guns in Drachen. And that's the thing. There's some artillery fire going on to a lesser volume before the big push. There's counter battery fire and there's harassment fire. And we're trying to interdict and stop you from building up for your push or building up your defenses against our push, right? So every turn in Drachen, after the reconnaissance is all resolved, there's going to probably be some artillery fire on a smaller scale going back and forth that you do resolve just simply deterministically. And then when you get to the time for the offensive, then indeed we resolve 1 or 2 waves of infantry combat, again, simply and deterministically, including more artillery and barrage and the release of depots of munitions for the big push that, everything kind of blasts away and the dust settles. And then victory will largely be determined by how well that offensive went.
Is it always
which is, again, based on how well did your reconnaissance campaign go?
Can the big offensive be launched by either side, or is it always by one side or the other?
So it's always by one side or the other. And we have the charm for gameplay of Verdun as a topic, because it's a battle from February to December 1916. And in different times, either the Germans or the French are on the offensive. So the scenarios, just like in Coast Watchers, the situations are like a snapshot in time. Like this is May 1916 is the scenario. And, the Germans are on the offensive or the French are on the offensive in each case. So one player is the attacker and has attacker objectives that are secret. And the other player is the defender and has defender objectives that are secret. And the objectives are cards that are kind of randomly dealt. And these cards also give you the amount of your forces. So not only do you not know exactly what it is your enemy is trying to achieve, you know that they're planning an attack, or they know that you know that they're planning to defend against your attack. That part is set for the situation. What you don't know is, are you up against a relatively large force or relatively small force? Are you up against relatively ambitious enemy objectives or conservative enemy objectives? And you're trying to find that out. And so that's also where the trench raids come in. Because with the trench raids, in trench warfare on the Western Front, I was always thinking why in the world, with the advantage that trenches and barbed wire and machine guns and artillery, why in the world would I purpose to take some number of my troops in this attrition warfare and go over the top for a raid, like go through the enemy wire and go into where the enemy is strong in his trenches, to try to wreck some stuff and come back? It just sounds like it's amazingly hazardous and giving the enemy the advantage to kill me, to kill my trench raiders. Why would I do that? And yet both sides, we know we're doing that routinely all the time. Why? And the main reason why is reconnaissance, is because that information that they could gain is so precious. We can find out what units are opposed to us because of, we can collect collar patches and things like that. We can, we're doing some damage to the enemy, but the main purpose is to collection. Is intelligence, is reconnaissance, is taking prisoners, finding unit identification, and perhaps even plans, documents that tell us something, and also a look at what the enemy, trench lines look like, what their fortifications look like, although that's handled by air power typically. Okay, it's information, it's reconnaissance. So the trench raids are part of this game. And if they go really well, if you push your luck and they go really well, you can even expose what your enemy's military objectives are. This represents taking some plans.
Plans, right.
Yeah. And so that's built in. So we have hidden objectives, but you can take risks and endeavor to find those hidden objectives out.
What's the board look like? Compared to say the Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers board is we've got a chunk of the South Pacific there.
Oh, I'll get you a version. I have a game set up on my current version of it, so I can't show you that, but I can show you an older version that's good enough. Hold on.
Okay, I'd love to see it.
We'll see how well this shows up in the glare. There's a lot of glare here. Okay, I don't know how well that shows up. This is with west up. So if we want to do it north up, be like this. Okay, so we have. How well does that show up there, Grant?
Well, I think it's. It'd probably show up better
okay.
if I could.
So I think you can see, like Coast Watchers, there's a bunch of places that are going to hold blocks, and
there we get a little bit tighter. Yeah, so I can see each of these is.
So I think you see it's the battlefield of Verdun, and it's rather more dense than Coast Watchers, which is like a string of islands and connections between them. But the spaces hold these blocks in a similar way. It's actually area rather than point to point, and this is an older version of the map that's messier than what it is now. It's actually a hex map, just with the shapes somewhat changed to make a more natural front line, a more natural flow of the Meuse River, things like that.
Right.
And they're differentiated by their lowland, or their hills, or their forts. So there's 3 different flavors that influence not only how difficult they are to assault, but do they have an observation advantage, right? So if you're up high, like on a hill, it's pretty easy for an observation post on the ground to observe what's going on below. So these slight rises that you find are so important in other parts of the Western Front that are more flat than Verdun are like a big deal. If the Allies can take Vimy Ridge, that's a big deal, because the Germans lose that observation ability. Well, in Verdun, it happens to be a lot of hills, and all the forts are on hills too, and so that's kind of your observation post. But of course, you put somebody up in a balloon, and they're 3,000 feet above that. Now, they can do a lot better even than your hilltop observation posts. And with an aircraft, you can go, further in and get right above what you want to see. And not only direct your guns or report back, you can photograph it. And now you can analyze the photographs and draw detailed trench maps and all of that. So all of that is happening on this map, but it's bigger than Coast Watchers. Coast Watchers, so Hunt for Blackbeard has 24 spaces, 24 location blocks. Coast Watchers 32. This has 64. So it's just, Verdun is a big, dense battle, right? The France and Germany are pouring their army resources into this little area that's, less than 20 miles across. And so you kind of feel that density in this game.
Yeah, totally.
And the question are the interactions chronological campaign linking the different scenarios? Yes. So in Coast Watchers, the different situations are chronological, and you can link them in campaigns of trios of scenarios, either the early part of the 1942-43 contest for the South Pacific, the middle part, the later part, or a sampling of each, right? So I would propose probably to do something, if that works well in Coast Watchers, I probably would do something similar here, but that I have not yet written. In fact, of the 9 scenarios that I have in mind, I've only really written 4 of them completely. So this one, of course, is, not as far as long as Coast Watchers. And there's some design work to go.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you're modeling the air? We're seeing the ground map. How do the balloons and the
Sure.
Reconnaissance planes work here?
Right. So both sides typically are going to have some balloons, and these balloons have they can see essentially everything within a longer range than a observation post that's just on a hilltop. And they even get a kind of a free action. So the balloons are very, very powerful for reconnaissance if they survive. But because they were so important and so potent for reconnaissance, both sides put a lot of effort into shooting them down. So we have the famous balloon busting missions. And so you have anti-aircraft guns, because there's anti-aircraft artillery. Even mobile truck-mounted anti-aircraft artillery is common already in this era, including forerunners of the famous 88 millimeter for the Germans. And so that's all in the game. And you, of course, with your air power, are not just protecting balloons and trying to shoot balloons down, but you're also doing a lot of aerial observation missions, and you're trying to chase those enemy aerial observers away. So we have air units, almost like we have patrols in Coast Watchers. It's it's an air unit. On one side, it's a single airplane representing singleton or small numbers of fighters. On the backside, it's a few planes representing a group, because during this battle, the French first figured out that if they flew in larger groups, it was more efficient and deadly than if these individual aces were doing their Knights of the Air thing, flying around. The Germans took them a month to figure out the French were on the right idea, and they did the same thing. All of that learning, setting up Bloody April, if you're into the history of the air war, the next year when the Germans really had the tactical advantage in April 1917. This is before all that, before Richthofen even, before the Albatross, is out there for a technological advantage. The Germans and the French are experimenting with these air attacks against you, so that's in the game. But it's fairly simple. You're assigning air missions to these areas. It might be as a barrier patrol, a defensive, keep enemies out of this area, protect your balloons or whatever, protect that part of your defenses from aerial observation. Yacht or hunt missions to chase off the enemy or shoot them down. So the kind of thing the aces like to do is fly into the enemy territory and look for trouble. And of course, spotting missions, aerial observation missions to see what the blocks are, to linger there and take photography and get that photography back to be processed to advantage ground operations, including trench raids. Bust the balloons.
I'm always totally amazed that the photography, where the state of photography was in 1916-17, that they took photographs from planes that were worthwhile in terms of reconnaissance, because the lenses were and the time,
right? So we have amazing technological innovation going on, and again, we have this kind of image, maybe as war gamers, that World War I trench warfare is very static, and it was the same in 1915-17. There's a tremendous amount of learning and technological progress going on, and we have a number of games, fortunately, out there that help show that. So this is one aspect: is the photography turned out to be so important, so it got a lot better. And originally, you didn't have cameras at all. Then you had people holding cameras. Pretty soon, you've got mounted cameras. And if we look now at the trench maps that they were using to plan their offensives or their trench raids, there's amazing detail on the layout of the enemy fortification systems. That's all acquired by aerial photography that in the game plays out in giving advantages to those ground operations. So the question from Olivia is it going to be published by Fort Circle or GMT like Coast Watchers? So this design, Drachen, is much closer to Coast Watchers than Hunt for Blackbeard. Hunt for Blackbeard I did several years ago, and it uses blocks in the same way. That is true, but there's a lot of other things that I have done in Coast Watchers to handle intelligence in 20th century warfare. And I started designing Coast Watchers this past August, and I started designing Drachen sometime in the fall. So these two are very, very close. And so I would not call Coast Watchers part of a series with Hunt for Blackbeard. It's not similar enough for me to say that the familiarity will be there. But Coast Watchers and Drachen in this Verdun game, different setting, certainly lots of differences in terms of how we apply these mechanics to that different kind of warfare. But when you play this game, you're going to recognize a lot from Coast Watchers, and it's going to help you learn to play the game. So this World War I Verdun game would be volume 2 in a series. And that series, if it's a series with Coast Watchers and GMT publishes Coast Watchers, then I think it's a GMT series. So my hope is that folks will like Coast Watchers gets made, and that there would be appetite among GMT fans for a volume 2 that takes Coast Watchers into World War I.
Given that the Coin series and the Levian campaign series, in both of those, you say you started out with the idea for 4 games on each one. What are the other 2 games that are in your mind for the Recon series?
I don't. I think maybe I've learned my lesson, not to, as was asked earlier, not to overthink it. I don't know what the next one actually would be, and I probably started working on Verdun earlier than I should have, because it is a it's a different. I'm not a great multitasker. I'm elderly, and so to have Hunt for Blackbeard in production and Coast Watchers in development, and to also be working on design on Drachen is probably, it's more obsession than it is productive behavior. So I don't know. And however, here's what I'm confident of, that this style of model would do well for any military situation where reconnaissance and intelligence really matter, linked to military force activities. And such situations in history are legion. Okay. So if it's cavalry and pre-industrial line conflict, if it's carriers or ships, or anything where if it's human intelligence operations in a military context, anything where what information I hold about you matters as much as what secrets you're keeping. The fact that I have this information and you don't exactly know what I have, and that matters to the outcome of the conflict, we could, I think, fruitfully apply these kinds of mechanics in this series. But right now, I'll be very happy if Coast Watchers gets made and has full solitaire for both players and people like it. I'll be delighted and forge ahead with Drachen, I promise. And after that, we'll see. But after that's the far-flung future.
Well, we have a question from Stephanie, and I know Stephanie from Twitter. She's a big solo player, so she's going to be very happy that the solo modes have been added to Coast Watchers, because these solo modes were a late development in the development of Coast Watchers game, right?
That's right. Originally, I wasn't going to do it. Gene Billingsley, GMT Games, convinced me to try, and then once I started trying, I was like, "Oh yeah, we can leverage some things in here." And so now we have with help from the playtest folks, I think we have what will be, solitaire modes that use almost all the aspects of two-player gameplay, so that you do really feel like you are playing the same kind of model. Will be variable enough, will be reactive enough to what you're doing, and easy to implement. So the last piece of that testing remains to show us is, will it be challenging enough to replace a human player? Do we let it, cheat cleverly enough to do that? And that we shall see. But I think we can get there. So how to stay motivated? So I mean, for me, again, this isn't a job. I don't earn my living this way. This is my most exciting way I know to explore history, and I have loved history since I was a young lad. So I from experience know that nothing happens particularly fast in board games. These kinds of productions are always years in the making, and I'm, as you can see, not just doing one thing at a time. And I like to get there. I like to bring the product to market. I like to see people playing it, and I like to get the feedback and then learn and improve. But the journey itself is a joy. So there's really no problem for me to stay motivated as long as the challenges are interesting, and the challenges are intensely interesting.
Well, I think we've covered everything about that I had on my agenda. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Volko, and also anybody listening? If there's any last questions, we should wrap things up in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But
yeah, we're probably over budget, so I'm happy to let folks go. And thanks everyone for sticking with us this far. But I'm also happy to take another question if there's something you see. I admit I've been so excited chatting with you that I haven't been scanning the comments for questions.
Yeah, I think I've managed to get all the things that were actually questions onto the screen. So I think we got all that. But well, thank you, Volko, and thanks everybody who showed up to watch, because I think this has been very interesting. I'm totally struck by your method of the way you look at design. It's I think it's your own thing.
Thank you, and thanks for letting me go on, and on specifically on the issue of game series and pitfalls and what I do have a couple of C3I pieces on that as well, about the samey versus familiar question, and the other one is bigger not always being better. That one pitfall that the Chad and Kai Jensen taught me is not to fall for is you don't always have to go bigger with the next one, and as I say that, I realized that Hunt for Blackbeard and then Coast Watchers and Drachen, all the one was bigger than the one before, but whatever's after Drachen will be smaller, I promise.
Well, I know John Butterfield said if he's got a problem with a game or a design that either he's designing or developing, the solution is always to take something away, not to add something.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. That's the most important decision, is what to leave out.
Right. Well, there we go. Thanks again, Volko. Thanks for everybody else.
Thank you, Grant. Thanks all.
Have a great end of the convention.
Enjoy the evening. Bye now.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did when I spoke with Volko. I'll be back soon with another regular episode of Pushing Cardboard. But in the meantime, feel free to drop by the website at pushingcardboard.com and let us know what you think. Or join us on the Discord server. You can find links to that on the website as well. Happy gaming.